I first came across John when I was planning the route for the Sacred Door Trail in Montana. A week before I got on the trail, Planet Walker just jumped off the bookshelf at me in Bozeman, and so I grabbed it and read it on the trail while I was kind of route planning. And that ended up in the guidebook. I said, if you're going to bring some books on your pilgrimage, bring Planet Walker as one of them. And again, it's just such an honor to be in this space and be held in this community and see some familiar faces and see Gigi. While I was in the planning process of the trail, I got a random email from a stranger, Gigi Coyle, and I mistakenly didn't ever respond to the email. And 2 years later, I met Gigi, and the first thing she said to me is, "I'm Gigi, I wrote you an email and you never wrote me back." Lesson learned. So I wrote a letter, or an article for the Center for Humans and Nature. It was an invitation from Steve to do some writing around the topic of pilgrimage. And that article will be somewhere, you can grab it maybe on the table out there. And that kind of explores my own more sort of analytical understandings of pilgrimage and is more of a linear expression of my understandings of pilgrimage. So I want to take this opportunity just to share my story in somewhat of a non-linear way, because I see this as really my first opportunity to tell my story in the presence of community, and specifically a community that I feel like can hold the story. When folks get off of the trail or any pilgrimage or any type of journey, I often encourage them to tell their story with community, but not just anybody. It's really important who we choose to tell our stories to, because if we share our stories of being in these sacred spaces, if we share our stories to the wrong ears, they can fall on unopened hearts and unopened minds, and we can lose power in our stories that way. But in the inverse, if we tell our stories to the right people, to open hearts and open minds in a space of non-judgment, those stories can become gifts for the listener, and those stories can gain in power and inspire new action and understandings and beauty in the world. So again, I thank you for listening to my story here today. And it really starts with this phrase, remember the sacred. Remember the sacred. Remember the sacred. The sun was rising over the desert east of Ojai. I had woken up at 4 in the morning, 8 miles out in the desert with 2 brothers, 2 dear friends of mine. And we woke up at 4, 2 hours before sunrise, and we set our intentions to do a ceremonial walk back to this oasis, about 6 miles to this little pool of water, little spring, and then we were going to do that walk alone, and then we were going to join up at the spring and then walk the other 2 miles back home. So we woke up at 4 in the darkness, and we set our intentions, and my friend had just happened to bring some mushrooms, and so we ate the mushrooms, and one by one we set off alone through the desert in the night. And I was the second to go out. And I remember as the sun was rising, my thoughts just dissipated with the dew as the sun came up, and I just fell into a deep presence of my body in communion with the land, in communion with the desert, in communion with the place, and the deep history that was speaking to me through that place. And out of this chasm of silence that I felt in my body and my spirit came these words, remember the sacred, remember the sacred. And that became my mantra for the 6 miles back to this water source. And I didn't know what it meant, and I knew that I didn't have to know what it meant, but I did know that it was a seed of sorts, an invitation to engage in an inquiry around what is the sacred, what is my relationship to the sacred, and part of that inquiry is what is my relationship to my body, and through my body, what is my relationship to place, And through place, what is my relationship to my community? And through my community, what is my relationship to the cosmos and the great mystery that we're walking with every day? And a few months later, I was 26 at the time. I did a 10-day Vipassana retreat, and in the middle of that deep silence, I realized that the dream of acting that I'd been pursuing for 27 years was no longer a dream. It was no longer the right dream for me, and so I felt into this deep space of unknowing. And a few months later, I was invited to another plant ceremony, medicine ceremony. And in that space, I was so anxious because I was riddled with uncertainty around my next step. And so really my intention for those ceremonies were to discover what my next step would be. You know, should I be a teacher? Am I going to be a psychologist? Should I go back to school for this or this or this? What's the answer? And the answer that arose out of that space for me was, you need to connect to your ancestry. That's your next step. And if you take that next step, another step will emerge for you in the process. So it wasn't exactly the answer I was looking for, but I trusted it. And so I got a job in Europe teaching theater at a school in Switzerland. And while I was in Switzerland, I did a lot of research around my own ancestry and planned a pilgrimage, my own personal pilgrimage, hiking through the lands of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England. And through that pilgrimage on foot, connecting with the land, and through that connection to the land, offering my prayers to the land, offering poems and songs to the land through my footsteps, connect with my ancestry in those spaces. And at the end of that, I got an invitation to go hike the Camino de Santiago, a Catholic pilgrimage trail that's beautifully celebrated in the other room. And on that walk, thinking about pilgrimage and what it had been allowing me in my own life to remember and reconnect to, I got the idea for the Sacred Door Trail. And which the idea came as creating this trail in America that doesn't celebrate one belief system or another, but rather celebrates this idea of interdependence, right? Celebrating the interdependent connection that exists between ourselves, our communities, the land, and the sacred, however we choose to define that. So I came back to the States, and through a series of synchronicities and heartbreaks, landed up back in Montana. And did I just lose? And so I got connected randomly to the American Indian Institute. I think I'm losing this a little bit. Got connected to the American Indian Institute, and I told them about this kind of vision that I had for the trail. And the director of the American Indian Institute said, we want to help you, and we want to connect you to some elders in these areas of Montana that might want to support you in this process and in this journey. So my first stop was with Johnny Arley, who was a elder for the Salish Kootenai outside of west of Glacier National Park. And Johnny believed in the vision and said, we want to support you. So he connected me to their heritage, their cultural organization, and got their support. And then from there, we started to branch out to other faith-based leaders and organizations to get their supports, also environmental and peace-building organizations. The Jeanette Rankin Center for Peace was one of them. And we started to kind of figure out where we wanted this land, this trail to go. And we discovered, with the help of this Montana legend and rambler walking Jim Stoltz, we found this section of trails that we thought could connect around the Big Hole Valley in southwestern Montana. That was a shared space, shared between many different tribes way back in the day. And it was just a shared hunting corridor, travel corridor for trade. And so it felt like a good spot to kind of, for this project to move forward in. Like it was an opening there. And so I spent 3 years on different trails throughout the summers, months at a time, out in the wilderness, exploring, does this trail connect to this trail? A lot of times the trails in Montana haven't been used in decades, so they don't really exist, though they show up on maps. And we finally pieced together this trail system that created this loop around the Big Hole Valley going through 3 mountain ranges and ironically circumnavigating the town of Wisdom. And so in 2012, I had written a guidebook for it, kind of created this alliance of support for it from different indigenous and faith-based leaders, both in Montana and beyond. And we had a 3-day ceremony where we invited everybody to the land to bless the land and the path in their own traditions to establish it as a shared sacred space and path. And from there, the following year, a group of young folks came up to me and said, "We want to hike this. Will you facilitate this process for us?" And I said, "Sure." And it ended up being a really powerful experience. And so I thought, wow, well, this could be a program. And so for the past 6 years, I've been offering this program. Once a year, we bring together 8 strangers that want to go on pilgrimage together, and we circumnavigate the Sacred Door Trail. And during the year, I now live in Brooklyn, just the other side of Bozeman. And you know, I've been thinking about the power of pilgrimage, and every summer witnessing the healing that happens for people that go on this trail. And though the insights are varied and diverse around what comes up for people, I've started to kind of notice this pattern that the insights have to do with remembering, right? But not remembering in terms of recollection, re-membering, re-establishing our connection to these larger living systems that support us, restoring ourselves back into connection with those relationships, with the deeper voice in ourselves, that deeper authentic voice that's connected to soul, spirit, and the sacred. That's one relationship that gets often not fully restored, but the conversation starts out there and continues onward. And then the second relationship is to place and environment. The third is to community. And the fourth is to the sacred, to the numinous, to people's own relationship with mystery, awe, wonder, grief, pain, mystery. So I saw the power of needing to be remembered into those relationships, and I began to become curious of how can we do those in urban spaces? How can we create shared sacred spaces that allow for the same type of embodiment and remembering to happen? And so that's what I've been exploring in Brooklyn for the past couple years. And a lot of that happens through just bringing community together in reflective dialogue around the grief that we hold in relationship to those primary relationships. And out of these circles, one of kind of the healing actions that we're trying to galvanize around now as a community is to create a Rights of Nature initiative for the ecosystems of New York City. And one way that we want to start to pull people into this Rights of Nature movement, Lake Erie just got a Rights of Nature bill passed, recognizing it as having personhood, giving it standing in a court of law, moving it from property to personhood. So this Rights of Nature is big, and it's moving across the country and the world today. So we want to support that in New York City. And so one of the creative ways that we want to invite people into this movement and this process is through pilgrimage, and through doing certain walks that trace historical moments of New York's intersection with people and culture and place. So moving up, one path that we have lined out is moving up from Broadway and Wall Street, where they used to sell slaves, moving up through that space where Wall Street still remains a expression of shadow and disconnection in the world in a lot of different ways. Moving through that, then coming out to the coast and walking along the Hudson and going up north, and then spending the night in a church or a temple or a yoga studio up there, because part of what pilgrimage is important is it gets you out of your comfort zone. So we don't want people to return back to their homes that night, even though they're in their home city. We want to stay in a different spot that night. And then we loop back down in the morning and complete the 36-mile loop. And be in conversation, be in dialogue, be in community, not just with each other and the ecology, but the history of the place. How does history inform ecology? How does, to remember, we also have to remember our history too. And we have to sit with the pain and the questions that come up around our histories. And out of the sitting with that pain, then perhaps new understandings, new stories can arise out of that pain in that space. How am I doing? 2 minutes. So I want to close with just one last quote, some writing that I did that's in this article, just about what pilgrimage might perhaps be. Perhaps pilgrimage, regardless of purpose, is ultimately an expression of healthy power. Power that derives its source from embodiment, from the body of the earth, the body of the journeyer, the body of the group, and from the body of soul and spirit, that larger than human force that connects us to the cosmos, and in turn, beauty, awe, wonder, and most importantly, magic. In this embodiment, we find healing. In this embodiment, we are restoried and remembered and reimagined. In this embodiment, we are given the seeds of our future selves to take home and water through our work, our relationships, and our lives. In this sense, the end of the pilgrimage is really only just the beginning of a much larger conversation and journey into remembrance. Remember the sacred. Remember the sacred. Remember the sacred. Thank you.